Well, I'm trying to think if this is an opportunity or if I should be scared here about the answer that I'm about to have to
He didn't really give much of an answer. That's special report for this time. Please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned for the Fox Report with Shepard Smith. More news, fair, balanced, and unafraid.
The game is over. We hope the peace will prevail, and that's all what we hope.
It's 7 p.m. in Washington, 3 a.m. in Baghdad. The headline from the war as Fox reports tonight, it's over. That from the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations saying, as far as he's concerned, the war is finished. Premature for that, perhaps, but Saddam Hussein's rule over Iraq is certainly crumbling. His power evaporating, if not vanishing entirely. American tanks rumbling with little resistance into Baghdad, Saddam's seat of power and the heart of his dark regime. Baghdad is no longer controlled by a dictator. Images of the toppling of this statue seen round the world. Years of pent-up anger and fear spilling over as Iraqis storm the fallen icon, beating it with their shoes, the ultimate insult in this part of the world, then dragging Saddam's bronze head through the streets. No clues to the dictator's whereabouts. Even his information minister, prone to outrageous claims of Iraqi war dominance, now silent.
Saddam Hussein is now taking his rightful place alongside Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, Ceausescu in the pantheon of failed, brutal dictators. And the Iraqi people are well on their way to freedom.
Elsewhere in Iraq, the fightings and the firefights and bombings continue. As our military leaders warn, it will go for some time. But clearly, the end days are these. On Top Story Duty tonight, the first Pentagon reporter to say this city would fall from within. Our own correspondent, Brett Baer, live at the Pentagon. Brett?
Shep, tonight Baghdad has fallen. Senior defense officials say the Iraqi regime no longer controls their capital city, and coalition forces are continuing to expand their control over greater areas inside Iraq. That said, all here acknowledge some fierce fighting could lie ahead. Today, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld called the images coming out of downtown Baghdad breathtaking. Firdos Square in downtown was the center of celebration. Saddam Hussein's statue ripped down. The head of that statue dragged around that square as Baghdad residents hit it with their shoes, considered to be one of the most insulting symbolic actions in the Arab world. Privately, senior defense officials here at the Pentagon were elated with the developments and the message that was sent. But publicly, the reaction was one of cautious optimism.
While it's wonderful to see the faces of the Iraqi people being liberated and to feel the joy they have to feel to be free of that vicious regime, nonetheless, the task that the terrific young men and women on the ground there are performing isn't over, and they're going to continue to be in danger until the entire mission is completed, which it is not.
And even as celebrations rang out in Baghdad, so did gunfire in other parts of the city. Iraqi paramilitary and Special Republican Guard troops taking shots at U.S. soldiers. One senior defense official said today guerrilla attacks by small pockets of enemy fighters in the next phase, the stabilization phase, could put coalition troops in even more danger than they have faced so far.
There's tons of rooftops we watch and tons of angles that they can shoot us from. It's still dangerous. It won't be safe to go out of here.
Fighting inside the capital presents a substantial risk to coalition forces, and we cannot and must not become overconfident.
In the north, U.S. Special Forces working with Kurdish fighters took over a town just north of Mosul as C-130 transport planes started flying in heavy equipment and supplies to the frontline forces in the north. Oil fields in northern Iraq are still in enemy hands tonight and believed to be rigged with explosives, a major concern. Defense officials say Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit is now seen as one of the last cities with significant Iraqi troop presence, and those troops are being pounded from the air tonight. As for Saddam Hussein and his two sons, their fate is still unclear tonight. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said Iraq's dictator may be under the rubble of that building that was hit, but in every way, he is ineffective.
He's not been around. He's not active. Therefore, he's either dead or he's incapacitated or he's healthy and cowering in some tunnel someplace, trying to avoid being caught. What else can one say?
With fighting still ahead, senior defense officials say the top priorities now are to recover the 7 American prisoners of war and to find Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And tonight, U.S. officials confirmed to Fox News that U.S. intelligence officers are now on the ground in Baghdad trying to find scientists that could lead them to that WMD. Shep?
Brett Baer, live at the Pentagon. Tonight, Saddam's United Nations ambassador says the game is over.
What do you mean that the game is over, sir?
The war, I mean.
If surrender comes, who will do it? Or was that it?
I have no communication with Iraq.
Freedom's flood in the streets of Baghdad, seen from the ground. Shelling the front lines in the north. Controlling more of the south. And in America, a wave of relief for Iraqi exiles for whom home is now a step closer. Day 21 of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The day Saddam fell on the Fox Report. Right now.
Live from the world headquarters of Fox News in New York, this is the Fox Report with Shepard Smith. Fair news, balanced news, now.
Jubilation, celebration, exhilaration in the streets of Baghdad, waving posters of the man for every intent and purpose is their former leader, then tearing them apart. The tens of thousands of created images quickly becoming a target of hate and rage for many Iraqis, some asking to send a message to our president, the man they called their liberator.
Thank you, Mr. Bush. We very like Mr. Bush. Mr. Bush, okay.
The first taste of freedom, the sweetest. We have Team Fox coverage of the liberation of Iraq. Eric Shawn live at the United Nations. Jim Engel live at the White House. First, Greg Palcott live outside our newsroom in neighboring Amman, Jordan. Greg?
Shepard, it was a day that few of us who have covered this Iraq story for so long ever thought that we would see. The symbolic end of the Saddam Hussein regime, jubilation in the streets of Baghdad. It started early this morning with Marines rolling into the streets of the eastern side of the Iraqi capital. They had encountered some small arms fire, but little in the way of real resistance from the once vaunted Iraqi Republican Guard. That added American presence and the absence of any real Iraqi police or security presence prompting a spontaneous outpouring of feelings against that dictator who had oppressed the people of Iraq for so long, particularly among the big Shiite Muslim population in the city of Baghdad. And then a scene right out of the end of the communist governments of Eastern Europe, the toppling of one of the many statues around town of this hated ruler. Baghdad residents actually had a hard time doing it on their own. They got a little help from the U.S. military. And then the head of Saddam, or at least the head of that statue of Saddam, literally dragged through the streets of Baghdad and stepped on, as was mentioned, the worst insult possible in the Arab world. Saddam himself, that omnipresent minister of information, in fact, the entire inner circle of Saddam, nowhere to be seen on this very busy day. And amid the jubilation, widespread rampaging and looting first targeted government offices and ministries, and then the UN headquarters, and then private shops and residences, a hint of feared anarchy to come. In fact, Shepard, there are a lot of questions remaining. The establishment of a new government, the healing of old hatreds, and an unfinished war, a war yet to be completed throughout the country. However, to someone like myself who has seen up close and personally the horrors that have been imposed on the Iraqi people by Saddam Hussein, at least one day of celebration should be allowed. Shep.
Greg Palcott live in Amman, Jordan. They got it down. That from President Bush watching this scene on this network today, as hundreds of millions must have watched on networks around the globe. But he's not declaring victory just yet.
Total victory means total freedom for the Iraqi people everywhere in Iraq, not just in some cities, not just in certain religious areas and the Shiite communities, but everywhere in all communities for the Iraqi people. That's what the president is focused on in this mission. That also will enable us to make certain that the regime is fully disarmed everywhere in all their hiding places, anywhere.
The White House says it still does not know whether Saddam is dead or alive. Coalition forces are still in harm's way. And contrary to what the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations says, the war is not over. Our Team Fox coverage continues of the liberation of Iraq. Jim Angle, senior White House correspondent, live there tonight. Jim?
Hello, Shep. Well, President Bush was in meetings when Saddam's statue and apparently his government fell, but Mr. Bush emerged in time to see Iraqis celebrating the beginning of a new era. Now, even though officials saw the jubilation in the streets as further evidence the central regime has collapsed, Fleischer said the president and others are emphatic the war is not yet over and that we must expect desperate tactics until the regime's final breath. So the president's reaction after watching today's extraordinary events, Fleischer said, was mixed.
Measure of caution, but also an expression of the power of freedom that we are seeing in the streets of Baghdad for the Iraqi people who yearn to be free.
Vice President Cheney was actually speaking to newspaper editors as Iraqis were celebrating what appeared to be the end of the Saddam era, and he lamented the anger in much of the Arab world over how it came about.
I see the outpouring of joy on the streets of Baghdad today by the Iraqi people at their liberation. And still the U.S. is subject to criticism from our friends in the region.
Nevertheless, with Saddam Hussein's regime in full rout, the vice president couldn't help but note that the U.S. military strategy had worked brilliantly as he strained not to say, "We told you so."
In the early days of the war, the plan was criticized by some retired military officers embedded in TV studios. But with every day and every advance by our coalition forces, the wisdom of that plan becomes more apparent.
But there was no gloating here today. Instead of a sense of celebration, it was more an affirmation that the administration made a plan and coalition forces carried it out with historic and surprising speed. And that now, at least the early results, are there for all to see. Shep.
Jim Angle, live at the White House.
Coming up.
Heading to the northern front, where some Iraqi fighters have not heard the words "game over" from their ambassador to the UN. We go live where they fight on. Exiled Iraqis celebrating their pending liberation right here in the heart of America, thanking the leaders of their new home for toppling the leaders of their old one. Our generals warning the war is not over. What exactly will it take for the president to address the nation, to make the announcement? Live to Central Command for some answers. From the news capital of the world, live to homes around the globe, this is your news, fair and balanced.
By the Iraqi army, not just in this location in the southeastern portion of the northern front, but in other areas around Kirkuk and Mosul. Special forces bringing in B-52 bombers and other strike aircraft from aircraft carriers operating in the eastern Mediterranean. What I can also tell you today is that in the 3 governorates of northern Iraq under Iraqi Kurdish control since the end of the Gulf War 12 years ago, there have been street celebrations, really marking the day that they believe that Saddam Hussein's regime has really been doomed to collapse. Iraqi Kurds have seen the television pictures of the demise of the regime in the Iraqi capital, and they turned out in their thousands in Duhok, Sulaymaniyah and Erbil, filling the streets, now knowing that after living in the shadow of Saddam Hussein for the past 12 years, they feel that all of Iraq now has a chance of living in freedom outside the tyrannical control of Saddam Hussein. Back to you, Paula.
Nevertheless, Brent, the Kurds you spoke with are expecting more fighting. Did they give you any sense of how long they think these kind of airstrikes will continue in this part of the country and the fighting will go on?
Well, clearly, Paula, the level of airstrikes I've seen over the past few hours has been the heaviest I've seen since the beginning of the war along this northern front. I think what we're going to see is a punch forward towards Baghdad. Baghdad's still about 90 miles away from the furthermost position. I think also you're going to see a lot of activity, as Donald Rumsfeld was just talking about in his briefing. Kirkuk, Mosul, Tikrit, still uncertain about their future. Mosul, Tikrit, still apparently under government control, the old central government control. And what about Tikrit? And more importantly, where could Saddam Hussein have run to if he was able to bolt from the Iraqi capital in the dying hours of his regime? The north is still a very big area, and very few eyes and ears of the US in any strength, military strength, on the ground here. We may see armor and troops move up from the south. We may see elements of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which has been arming with tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles over the past few days, moving from north to south, perhaps squeezing the remaining part of the country between those two moves. It's still too early to say. Paula.
Thanks so much, Brent. Brent Sadler reporting from the northern part of Iraq. And still to come tonight, the U.S. flag over the face of Saddam Hussein. That image was played over and over again on Arab television. Was it the wrong message? We'll be talking with someone from the Al-Jazeera network at the half-hour mark. Also ahead, as Iraqis celebrate in the streets of Baghdad, do dangers remain for coalition troops in and around the Iraqi capital? There are some big challenges ahead, but next, where's Saddam Hussein? Our David Enzer tries to answer that question straight out of the break.
Day 22, the fall of Saddam. CNN Tonight at 8. Paula Zahn with Wolf Blitzer in Kuwait investigate what happens next. From who will rule Iraq to the search for POWs. Plus all the day's events live from the front lines. CNN Tonight, 8 Eastern.
Welcome back. With Iraqi citizens cheering in the streets, coalition forces pushing on with their war plan, and disarray in Baghdad. One key question tonight remains: where is Saddam Hussein? National security correspondent David Enzer standing by and explains to us how that is nagging at U.S. officials.
As the regime appeared to go up in smoke, U.S. officials said its control in Baghdad has disintegrated. As for Saddam Hussein, officials still don't know his fate.
He's either dead, or he's incapacitated, or he's healthy and cowering in some tunnel someplace, trying to avoid being caught.
He is still important because there are people who will continue to fight as long as he is alive.
Rumors flew that Saddam might be in the Russian embassy in Baghdad. False, said the Russians, and U.S. officials too. It seemed clear after meetings at the White House that senior intelligence officials were pleased with the way things are going. But urgent tasks remain, including finding weapons of mass destruction, keeping any of them from moving out of the country. The U.S. is offering rewards and amnesty for help. U.S. intelligence must also account for all the members of the regime, the intelligence, the police, the Fedayeen Saddam that may still be alive, and figure out who in Iraq can be trusted. It is a mammoth task.
Vet Iraqi personnel, vet Iraqi bureaucrats, determine those who really do have enough blood on their hands that they probably should be excluded from a post-war administration, and those who can be brought back in and help to set up a new transitional authority to help to administer the country.
Then there are the neighbors to worry about. Secretary Rumsfeld complained about the role of Syria.
Senior regime people are moving out of Iraq into Syria, and Syria is continuing to send things into Iraq. We find it notably unhelpful.
U.S. officials say despite a lot of rumors, they have no solid information that any senior Iraqi official has entered Syria, though some of their families have. That border is being watched very closely by the U.S. And Paula, just to mention one other thing on the Saddam front, there was a report tonight on one network suggesting that Saddam had, that there was information that he had been eating in the restaurant next to the site that was bombed on Monday, that he escaped. His bodyguards pulled him out of the restaurant and he went off in a car and then may have been attacked subsequently. Officials I spoke to just now said, that's just a rumor. We're not sure that's true. Paula.
What else are they saying, though, David, about the kind of investigation will be needed to prove that that's not true once they have access to the site where these bunker buster bombs hit?
Well, clearly the site will need to be taken apart bit by bit, and there'll need to be forensics done, DNA analysis possibly done on the remains of those who were at the site. But in addition to that, U.S. intelligence is making no assumption that that was a successful hit. They are pursuing a number of other ways to try and keep track of Saddam Hussein and the other leaders, his sons and the other leaders, in the event that they are still alive. They're making no assumption that he's dead at this point, Paula.
David Answer, thanks so much. So, Wolf, there are a number of theories tonight as to what happened to Saddam Hussein. You probably heard David just saying that one American television network reporting that he was eating at the restaurant nearby, whisked away by bodyguards. Not too sure what happened after that, but I understand you had a conversation with the head of the Iraqi National Congress, and he advanced a different theory. What did he tell you today?
Well, Ahmed Chalabi, the leader of the INC, is now in Nasiriyah in the southern part of Iraq with a few hundred of his supporters, the Free Iraqi Fighters, as they're called. When I interviewed him earlier today, he thought Saddam Hussein was definitely alive, someplace just north of Baghdad with at least one of his sons. He thought he had some good evidence to that, although the Pentagon and Central Command can't back that up by any means, but he seems to think that there's pretty good evidence Saddam is just outside Baghdad in one of the northern suburbs. We'll continue to watch that, see what else we get on that front. In the meantime, despite the falling statue and the raucous celebrations, U.S. military planners say the war is by no means over, at least not yet. The Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, said today, and I'm quoting, "There's a lot of fighting that's going to be done." CNN's Miles O'Brien is joining us now with a look at what's next for the coalition forces. Miles?
Wolf, these past 3 weeks we've heard a lot about Basra and Nasiriyah and, of course, Baghdad. Perhaps in the days ahead we're going to be hearing a little bit more about Tikrit and Kirkuk and Mosul. Joining me to talk a little bit about what is next and specifically what is going to be going on in the north of Iraq is General David Grange, retired U.S. Army. General Grange, I want to go right into a spot in the world right where Brent Sadler was. He just filed a report a few moments ago. It's a place called Kalar. This is in that area that is disputed between the Kurds and formerly the Saddam Hussein regime. That was an interesting report in that it showed the value of special forces. Explain how that works as a force multiplier, if you will.
Yeah, Miles, you had two, maybe more special forces operators working with the Kurdish fighters, trying to work out a plan of attack, supporting them with some very small weapons, but deadly weapons, but trying to coordinate how to take down this target. And it's very similar to how special operations worked in the first war. I can remember when a prince in Saudi Arabia in a northern base said, what can you bring to the fight? You only have a few people. What can you do for us? You have no tanks, artillery. I said, Prince, what we can bring to this fight is I have a radio. And that radio can bring in a lot of things in my hip pocket. B-52s, attack helicopters, jets, and also I have a lot of people that know how to fight wars.
All right,
and that did it, and that's what's happened here.
The radio may be powerful, but when you move toward Tikrit, and let's move our satellite imagery over there, earthviewer.com, from Kalar over to Tikrit. Tikrit, of course, is the hometown of Saddam Hussein, his tribe, his people, and we're going to zoom in on this compound of palaces that are maintained there. And that supposedly is defended by a special, a Republican Guard division, the Adnar division. Can walkie-talkies and a couple of special operations people take care of that?
No, because the special operations forces will not be taking Tikrit. Who will take Tikrit will be U.S. or other coalition forces, maneuver units, heavy units, supported by special forces and other special operations teams. But no, heavy forces will take down Tikrit.
All right, General David Grange, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now we'll send it back to Wolf.
Thanks very much, Miles. Thanks to General Grange as well. Still to come this evening, a family separated by war in Iraq. A wife trying to make contact stateside with her husband who's back in Iraq, also ahead. The French and the Germans were against this war. With the statue of Saddam Hussein now in pieces, what are they saying? But next, Casualties of war, hospitals completely filled, the dire situation as CNN's special coverage of the war in Iraq continues.
CNN's continuing coverage of the war in Iraq. Baghdad has fallen. Symbols topple as the regime crumbles. Iraqi Americans celebrate and speak out. At 9 on Larry King Live, go inside the Iraqi capital on the day it appears Saddam Hussein's regime has officially become
your home country of Iraq and all this amazing history we saw today with the celebrations in the streets with our troops arriving. You've seen democracy work in the United States as you become an American. Can democracy work in your home country?
Yes, sir. I believe so, and I have faith. We have a lot of educated people in Iraq. I think we could transfer this establishment, this democracy into Iraq. I'm not going to say and exaggerate and say, yes, it's going to happen tomorrow or maybe in 2 years or maybe in 3 years. But you know what? If we work hard on it, if we set up an example to the rest of the Arabic countries, we could work hard on it. We could give it some dedication. We give our hearts and we put everything into it. Yes, I believe so. And I have a lot of faith in our community and the Iraqi people that we could do it.
Ahmadi, it's a great thing to have you in the show.
Thank you, sir.
And I hope you like my home city, Philly. It's great to have you from Philly tonight.
I love Philly. Okay. I'm an Eagle fan all the way.
Okay, thanks a lot. Up next, the latest headlines. Plus, why are the images of the war in the Arab media so different than what we're seeing here at home? They're not as good a picture, I got to tell you. Our special edition comes back in a minute.
Tonight,
a lot of news coming out of Baghdad today.
U.S. airstrikes target Saddam's leadership.
That fighting this morning was intense.
Up to the minute, Allied military developments.
A major step forward toward a new Iraq.
The news you need from the reporters you trust. Stay with Fox News Channel's powerful primetime lineup for the latest on the war in Iraq.
Iraqis in Baghdad celebrating their liberation just 3 weeks into the war. The Pentagon still assuring us there are dangerous days ahead. Some tough questions need to be answered as well. Who will lead a post-Saddam Iraq? Who will police it? How do you build a democracy from nothing, where a dictator ruled for decades? A Fox report now from Anita Vogel.
As the coalition works to topple the Saddam Hussein regime, the question arises, who will replace him?
Now, this is not going to be very easy to do.
We will take a lot of our learning from intelligence that we've gathered, but also from the knowledge of the people in the towns that we occupy.
Controlling real estate is one thing, establishing new leadership is another, but it's worked before. At the end of World War II, the Nuremberg trials wrote the final chapter of the Nazi regime, and there were similar proceedings in the Pacific.
We did actually hang a Japanese general for his failure to control his troops in Manila when those troops were involved in the mass murder of Filipino civilians.
As Saddam's allies are tracked down, finding the right person to lead is a difficult job. In Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai rose to the top after leading the Northern Alliance against the Taliban. And although outsiders are leading the fight to remove Saddam, there is no question the future of Iraq must remain in the hands of Iraqis.
A good guy is a person who may have cooperated with the Saddam regime, but has turned against that regime.
It won't be easy. Along with those who remained under Saddam's rule, thousands of Iraqi exiles will be returning to take part in a new government.
We can go back and we can build a society in Iraq that will become a beacon for the entire Middle East.
In the words of one observer, the next weeks and months are going to be a very tricky period. More challenging, perhaps, than winning the war. In Los Angeles, Anita Vogel, Fox News.
They were welcomed by Iraqis who celebrated their freedom after decades of oppression under Saddam Hussein. And as we've been watching all day today, in an image for the history books, the statue of the Iraqi dictator torn down in the heart of Baghdad by U.S. forces and the jubilant Iraqis. The White House says President Bush calls it a powerful expression of freedom. And a reminder, we bring you the latest headlines every 15 minutes here on MSNBC. Now more Hardball with Chris Matthews.
Saddam Hussein is now taking his rightful place alongside Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, Ceausescu in the pantheon of failed, brutal dictators.
Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld says that the era of Saddam Hussein is nearing its end. I'm Chris Matthews, and this is a very special edition of Hardball. Saddam Hussein's rule over Iraq crumbles today as the city of Baghdad falls to American forces, and the Iraqi streets erupt in celebration and welcome of the U.S. forces. In this half hour, why doesn't Arab media show these jubilant faces, these images that we're watching right now? But we begin this half hour with NBC's David Schuster, who's at Central Command in Doha, Qatar. David.
Chris, officials here at Central Command continue to downplay any sense of euphoria or excitement, in part because of political considerations across the Middle East, also in part because they don't want to start celebrating before the military operations are completed. But in any case, officials are confirming that the area of Tikrit, the area in northern Iraq, is simply being pounded tonight, that it is facing some of the heaviest bombardments of the war, in part because, as of a week ago, there were 900 aircraft essentially focused on an area the size of California. Now you have those same resources focused on an area the size of Rhode Island. Officials say that special ops continue to work very hard from the ground to direct aircraft to targets where there is still some Iraqi resistance in northern Iraq. But there is an expectation here that the area of Tikrit, Mosul, Kirkuk, that area should fall very quickly, perhaps in the next couple of days. There continue to be leaflet drops, special ops, a lot of activity in northern Iraq, and some signs, perhaps, that area will start to crumble pretty soon. Regarding Baghdad, officials say that there are already some civil affairs teams that are in Baghdad working to try to figure out how to get the power on, the electricity, the water. They're also trying to figure out how to organize a possible police force and return some level of order to the city. Civil affairs teams have been working throughout much of southern Iraq, and there is apparently a very intense effort to bring them up to central Iraq as well. But again, officials are downplaying any sense of euphoria or excitement, in part also because of more than 100 Americans lost their lives in this battle, as well as 30 Brits and possibly tens of thousands of Iraqis, and also, of course, a couple journalists. So there's not a great deal of excitement or "we told you so" kind of feeling from Central Command, at least not publicly. Chris?
Okay. Thank you very much. That's NBC's David Schuster at Central Command. As Iraqis celebrate their liberation in the streets of Baghdad today, how did the Arab media react? Here's NBC's Patricia Savga.
In the streets of London, Iraqi exiles celebrate Saddam's downfall.
Thank you very much, America!
At this London cafe, customers like Ali Al-Zargon, who spent nearly 10 years in one of Saddam's notorious prisons, can hardly believe this day has come.
Today, very happy.
No one here is shedding a tear for Saddam Hussein, but some have mixed emotions, skeptical of America's true intentions toward Iraq and the rest of the Arab world.
Some here see Saddam's overthrow as a warning sign of American ambition.
They won't occupy and dominate the region.
I believe there will be a lot of ambivalence, anxiety, questions as to who's next, what's next in Iraq, and who's next in the neighborhood.
Along with images of cheering Iraqis, Abu Dhabi TV also broadcast these images. U.S. soldiers in battle, an injured civilian. And as Al-Jazeera showed an American flag thrown over a statue of Saddam, a reporter declared that everything in Iraq will now have an American face. A message not lost on viewers in Cairo who questioned whether Iraq will be better off now that Americans are in charge.
They are not the saviors of Iraqis.
A distrust that extended to France, home to some of this war's most vocal opponents. Today, people were divided.
Who is going to rule the country? We don't know. Is it the Americans? Is it going to be the United Nations?
It's really a good news that the end is over now.
But winning over the hearts and minds of the Arab world and beyond may prove tougher than bringing a tyrant to his knees. Patricia Savga, NBC News, London.
Edmund Gharib is a professor of Iraqi studies at Georgetown. Professor, thank you for joining us. That was an interesting choice of music for Arab television. Wagner, The Flight of the Valkyries. I haven't heard that since I saw Robert Duvall in Apocalypse Now. You know, he used to say, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory. Who came up with that little music score for this thing?
The good question. There's a great deal of sophistication there.
Well, what do they do? Accusing us of being Nazis by playing Hitler's favorite composer?
I don't know if that was was actually the intended purpose. That's probably selected. They select a lot of music. I don't think that was intended, but who knows? I mean, that's something.
Well, what is the image they're getting? You've been watching Al-Jazeera, etc. today. What are they getting?
I think you have seen the same kind of pictures that we have seen here. There have been pictures also of people who have been welcoming the troops, who have raised
I've
signs,
heard the opposite.
criticizing. There have been both. And then there have been also questions raised about U.S. policies in the area, about U.S. intentions. You've had also pictures of the dead and the injured, especially among the civilians. So you've had both pictures which were portrayed.
What picture, how's this American, let's do it this way, Professor. We're watching American television. We're on American television. American television is showing the celebration of these people at our arrival all day. How does that compare to Arab television? Well,
you don't get only the picture of the celebrations of the arrival of the American troops, of the welcoming of the American troops. You get that. You also got the picture, for example, of the American flag being planted near Saddam Hussein's statue.
Yeah, we got that too.
And that was something that was planted there. There was also, you got a great deal of analysis today about what does this mean. There were people who said, actually have described the fall of Saddam Hussein as the fall of a dictator. You've had people who said that this is actually a dramatic event, a historical event, that they compared it actually to what happened in 1948, what happened in 1967.
Well, you know, in the West and in Israel too, I always thought the difference between Israelis and Arabs is that Israelis had a sense of irony. And occasionally, most of them, when you talk to them, will say, yeah, you got us on that one, or that's kind of embarrassing, we shouldn't have done that. When you're dealing with Arabs, as a generalization, they never say you got me. It's always we're right, it's always you're wrong. Watching this today, how will an Arab watching television say, oh, that's all set up, that's phony? Or will they say, those people must have really hated that bastard?
No, I think people in the Middle East know two things. First of all, they know that Saddam Hussein, maybe some people fear Saddam, some people respect Saddam, but not many people love Saddam Hussein. So that is something, an important point that people have to remember when you're talking about the Arab street. When they defended people, there were demonstrations in the streets of the Arab world, they were actually opposed to the war. They were very much opposed to what they felt that was going to be a great deal of destruction of an important Arab country. It's also important about Baghdad. Baghdad has historical symbolism for a lot of Arabs.
But we knew all that, and I knew all that, and I was one of the great skeptics and critics of this war. But when I see manifest evidence of people welcoming our troops, and I go, hey, there's something I didn't expect. It's new information. Do Arabs ever accept new information, or is it all a priori? We knew that.
I think one thing there
are they going to say? Is anybody in the Arab world saying? Let's go to Mr. Haladiri. Mohammed, is there anybody in the Arab world saying, my God, they really hated that guy? The Americans are the good guys.
Everybody in the Arab world has really understood what tyranny this regime is and what destruction it caused over 35 years. We see on camera the destruction that has happened over the past 2 weeks, but what happened in destruction and deaths before that in the 35 years are multiples, millions more, and that's what Arabs cannot understand.
Well, can they understand these pictures? I mean, obviously they can, but how do they interpret these pictures of jubilation?
You'll always have the naysayers saying, oh, there were just 200 people. You'll see day after day more Iraqis coming out. Even people here, I know people in North America that are living here in fear until today when they actually saw this happening. You can't understand, nobody can understand the amount of fear that this regime has instilled in every Iraqi in Iraq and outside.
Is the pictures we're seeing today, gentlemen, you first, Professor, likely to encourage or discourage the kind of hatred toward the West that leads to actual terrorism?
I don't think that there is hatred for the West. Sometimes there is a great deal of hatred for U.S. policies or for Western policies.
Well, there certainly was September 11th.
Yes, absolutely. But that was by a French group, by a radical group, which was very much opposed to what the United States stood for U.S. policies towards the region. And this is something that I think is important to remember here as when we're talking about this issue. I think the other thing that's very important to remember is that also the long-term implications of this. Is this really going to be seen as a liberation of the Iraqi people, or is it going to be seen as foreign occupation? People in the Middle East have a great deal of skepticism. They have a long historical memory. They remember, for example, General Stanley Maud, who, when after the end of the First World War, he moved into Baghdad with his troops, and he said, "We're here to liberate you. We are not here as conquerors."
I know about the betrayal.
So basically, how are they going to look at it? And a great deal is going to depend on what the U.S. does.
Mr. Haladiri, is there anything the United States can do following up on this jubilation of today that would satisfy the critics in the Arab world of our operation there?
You know, there are significant plans that are put in place, but what has plagued us in the Middle East is we keep living in the past and we don't look into the future. There is enough there that I have a lot of trust in the Iraqi people in conjunction with those who are well-intentioned in the coalition in the US and in the UK, that there's an opportunity for a brighter future, and the activities and the actions that will come in the next days, next weeks, will prove to those naysayers. Iraqis, once given a chance, will stand up and will assert we will no longer blame the world for our problems. Okay. We will take our destiny in our own hands.
Well, as we've learned the last couple of weeks, we'll see, won't we? Anyway, thank you, Mr. Gharib. Thank you, Ahmed Al-Haderi. Coming up, the latest headlines on the war, and later, reaction from the White House and Capitol Hill on the fall of Baghdad.
Reconcile with their own people before they face the fate of Saddam Hussein.
Hafez, our condolences to you and everyone at Al-Jazeera on the death of Tariq Ayoub, your correspondent in Baghdad. But do you really believe that the United States military deliberately decided to target him and Al-Jazeera, or was that an accident of war?
Well, thank you, Wolf, and I'd like also to thank Christiane Amanpour in particular, because she, in her comments yesterday, it was very brave and a very objective one about that what we heard so far and what we heard yesterday of justifications from the Central Command or the Pentagon was not convincing enough for people to say that you're really avoiding schools or mosques, and yet you're not avoiding dealing in a disproportionate way with some gunshots from a hotel where you know that all of the international media were there. Whether it's deliberate or not, I would really, on my personal level and view, you cannot say that someone in a democracy would really dare.
Killed yesterday when a U.S. tank shell hit the network offices in Baghdad. Back in 1988 and 1999, he worked for the Fox News channel as a producer there. He'd been in the capital since the start of the war. 2 other photographers killed when a U.S. tank fired on the Palestine hotel. Hundreds of international journalists are staying there. 10 have been killed in Iraq since the war started. Marine Sergeant Edward Smith died in Doha, Qatar last Saturday. The sergeant wounded the day before in central Iraq, a Chicago native stationed at Camp Pendleton. He was also a reserve officer for the Anaheim Police Department.
That was his job. Nobody made him do this, what he chose. And the bottom line was to take care of somebody else.
Sergeant Smith leaves behind a wife and 3 children. A Russian diplomatic convoy that came under fire may have been carrying Saddam's secret archives, that according to a Russian newspaper. The group Sunday evacuating Baghdad and heading to Syria when it was attacked. The paper reporting United States forces opened fire and tried to seize the documents. Russia's spy agency says the story is not true. The newspaper reporting earlier that Russian intelligence agents had been sent to Baghdad to get the files in case Saddam's regime fell. A bomb exploding in a Palestinian school in the West Bank, the blast wounding at least 20 teenagers. Police investigating whether vigilantes were behind the attack. An unknown Jewish group calling itself Revenge of the Infants claiming responsibility. Thousands of people in Gaza marching in the funeral of 7 Palestinians killed in a missile strike. Among the dead, a senior leader of the terror group Hamas and one of his deputies. Terror suspects arrested in Indonesia and a kidnapped boy rescued in Colombia as we go round the world in 80 seconds. The West Pacific. The USS Carl Vinson keeping an eye on North Korea. The carrier's crew getting ready in case it's called into action. Planes being catapulted off the deck more than 100 times a day. The ship's battle group finishing a month of war games with South Korea. It's set to stay in the region to show North Korea the U.S. is ready for anything. Indonesia, more suspects in the Bali nightclub bombing. Police handing 9 men over to prosecutors, including the man accused of planning the attacks. Last October's bombing killing more than 200, most of them foreign tourists. Police blaming a hardline Islamic group for that attack. Singapore, schools opening for the first time in about 2 weeks since being closed because of the SARS virus. The number of cases there still growing. Hundreds of people have been quarantined. The government now using the military to help screen people entering the country. The Catholic Church suspending confession to help fight the contagious disease. Colombia. Police raiding a house in Bogota and rescuing a 3-year-old boy. He was kidnapped a week ago. His abductors demanding a $170,000 ransom. But the police saying they received many tips which led them to the child. And that's a wrap on this Fox trip around the world in 80 seconds. Images of the war on a day of stunning visuals. And as the celebration spread throughout Baghdad, David Shader of Sky News in the United Kingdom was there. His experience coming up as Fox reports tonight.
Hussein. Well, I don't know. This is perhaps the American laws. I have no relationship with Saddam, so I can't tell you. I am here like you.
Explain to me, sir, though, what do you mean you have no relationship with Saddam? What does that mean?
No, I have no communication with Iraq. I am here, so I know nothing about what is going there.
What do you make, sir, of the pictures you've seen of?
The Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said it wasn't a game when asked about al-Duri's comments. He said the game was over when President Saddam Hussein didn't accept the UN resolutions. I asked some of the Iraqi ambassador's diplomatic colleagues about his assessment that the game is over.
I just heard that. I think it is, and I pay tribute to him for acknowledging it. He's a decent man, and I hope he finds a decent life representing a decent government. But he must wonder what his situation is now, and I sympathize with him.
He defended the positions of his country with courage, I would say. But of course, he was defending a very bad cause. He was defending a regime which had been condemned by the United Nations and which he expressed the worst kind of violation of human rights and of brutality in the region. Therefore, he had a difficult task. I hope him well.
Mohammed al-Duri will be the last UN representative of the Saddam Hussein government, but his seat and even himself, if he wanted to, could stay here for days, months as Iraq's ambassador, Paula, because there's a diplomatic process that has to take hold. A new government in Iraq, when that eventually is in place, would request through a letter applications for new credentials for a new ambassador. Paula.
So, Richard, did he have, or has he had over the last couple of days, any explanation for what happened to the much vaunted Republican Guard?
No. When I rode with him in his car yesterday to the UN, he asked me that. We were analyzing the situation, and he said, where are they? Where did they go? He was hinting that the war would still continue in other parts. He said yesterday his people would never accept, quote, foreigners, not for 1 second. That's what al-Duri said yesterday. Today, he is saying the game is over.
Richard Roth, thanks so much for the update. Now, many Iraqis are feeling a mixture of triumph and uncertainty right now. The taking of Baghdad by coalition forces signals a definite change in the war. And for an Iraqi woman in this country, it is bringing some renewed hope for a reunion. Siba Habib left her family in Iraq just before the war started to get medical treatment for her young son. He suffers from glaucoma.
The pressure is high for both his eyes, and it's very dangerous. He might be blind if I didn't give him treatment. It's very hard for me, but my husband was forced me. You must go for your son. I don't know, maybe they were losing their life. I'm very afraid about them.
Khalid Al-Casey is Habib's cousin. He joins us from Cleveland, Ohio, to tell us how the family is doing. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Khalid.
You're welcome.
First off tonight, what did the tearing down of that enormous statue of Saddam Hussein represent to your family?
It represents the moment they've been waiting for the past 35 years. It was joy, happiness. Everybody was happy and cheering. They were cheering with the Iraqi people that were over there cheering for their freedom.
We heard, though, that there were people in this crowd who felt quite humiliated by what they were witnessing. Do you understand those feelings?
You mean the flag?
Not that so much that, but just some Iraqi citizens standing on the sidelines, not sure how this is going to play out.
Oh, no. I think those people are very happy. They're very excited. The only thing is, nothing is 100% done yet, and nobody has confirmed that Saddam has been taken care of. That's why they
are here, Chris, and talking to Democrats in the hallways and listening to some of the candidates downstairs. They want to talk about the economy. They are glad that the war has gone as well as it did, but they can't wait to argue that whatever success we have in Iraq means we have to turn to domestic issues, number one, and more specifically the economy, and that's what they're going to drive toward. But interestingly, there's a division in the Democratic Party as displayed here. You had 4 Democrats who are in the Congress who voted for the resolution and who have been quite supportive and thankful for all the progress that's been made and wouldn't mind talking about the war some. But the big cheers again come for former Governor Howard Dean of Vermont, who gives the most stirring anti-war message of the major candidates. So the Democratic Party is divided, and I think will remain divided as much by the success of the president as anything else.
I think, Howard, what's interesting is we did hear from some of the Democrats earlier today addressing a labor organization, and what we heard is those that have been opposed to war were largely silent on the celebrations in Baghdad, that those 4 senators who have supported the war were, of course, expressing jubilation, as many others were, about the success in Baghdad.
Isn't that true, Howard,
right,
that the big winner today is Joe Lieberman, especially, who's been such a hawk, because he's vindicated. They are welcoming us in the streets. And why don't the damn Democrats give the president his day? He won today. He did well today.
Couple things. I think at that labor meeting earlier in the day, all the expressions of jubilation and support for the president were greeted with fairly stony silence from a lot of those labor leaders. My point is there's a Lieberman wing, which also, at least on the vote, included Edwards and Kerry and Gephardt. But there's an anti-war wing, and when Howard Dean said at the meeting tonight that no one in the Democratic Party should have voted for what he called the doctrine of preemptive presidential war, he got huge cheers from this crowd here. So in an odd way, the success of the war effort so far isn't going to still the peace wing of the Democratic Party. If anything, I think it'll inflame it if the neocons are arguing now that it's time to go from Baghdad to, say, Damascus.
Howard, we're all neocons now.
You know, Chris, the danger for the Democrats is that the Nebuchadnezzar wing of the Democratic Party.
How would you just give me some New Testament interpretation? What's the Nebuchadnezzar division of the Democrats?
It's now looks to be the activist base of the primary voters for the Democratic Party, and that's the danger for the party. To appeal to that wing, they're dangerously mispositioning themselves. With 80% of the public supporting this, they can't even show joy in the moment of triumph. They are emotionally isolating themselves from not only the Republican base, not even only the independents, but in fact rank-and-file Democrats today.
Yeah, because the rank-and-file Democrats, by every poll I looked at, Nora, maybe not on Capitol Hill yet, but in the real world, Democrats are for this war today.
They are, overwhelmingly. Over 50%. And
hey, 2/3 of women are for this war. I mean, usually women are anti-war. This war is relatively popular when you get 2/3 of the women of this country.
I think one of the things that is misleading, as there is this division between what you may call the McGovern party and perhaps even the Kennedy party, is that this notion, though, that Dean, while he's gaining momentum, is the front runner. He's not the front runner.
What's he going to talk about a year from now? The fact that the war went too well and it's over? I mean, don't these things sort of lose their? Isn't there a fresh date on some of these debate points?
That is why people like Senator and Howard is there with them, but why senators like Lieberman and Kerry from the beginning argued that people like Dean would hurt the party in the long term.
Okay. Did anybody sneak over to a television today that you saw Howard and cheer for the country?
Did any Democrats?
Yeah.
I'm sure I don't understand. No, I think people are cheering for the country. I mean, I think the Democrats here were just as riveted to the television sets earlier in the day from the ones I talked to. They were watching this with a great sense of relief and pride and patriotism, I think it's fair to say. But their political argument is, for the most part, it's time to focus on domestic issues. They looked at the war not just with a sense of pride and relief at having gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, but their theory is, at least it's their theory, that this will now, if the war goes well, if it ends quickly, if a administration, a coalition of the competent, as somebody said, gets into Iraq, then they, the Democrats, can come back to domestic issues, the budget, taxes, deficits, etc., which they argue, perhaps vainly, but they argue is where their success is going to be next year.
I mean, the problem for the Democrats is that the foreign policy defense issues don't end today. We have a lot of problems out there that are going to continue, and they have to come up with some kind of a plausible foreign defense strategy to present to the American public next election cycle.
Well, there might be a lot of conversions on the road to Damascus. There's been one before. Anyway, we'll be right back with Nora. I want to thank everybody. Nora Don, it's great having you. Thank you, Howard. Good luck at that exciting meeting tonight. I don't know if you can take the excitement over there. And Tony Blanky for joining us. Hardball returns tomorrow night at 6:30 Eastern. And coming up next, MSNBC's coverage of this incredible historic day continues with Keith Olbermann.
President Jacques Chirac of France in St. Petersburg at the weekend. Their discussions, like those of Tony Blair and President George Bush in Belfast, Northern Ireland this week, are likely to focus on the post-conflict phase in Iraq and just how much of a role the United Nations will play. Bush and Blair agree the need for a vital role for the UN. Schroeder and Chirac are insisting that the UN's role must be a central one. That may not prove to be the same thing. Robin Oakley, CNN, London.
And coming up in our next hour, what happens next now that Iraq's government has symbolically fallen apart? Who will fill the power vacuum? As our coverage of the war in Iraq continues, we'll be right back.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Heidi Collins at CNN Center with a check of the headlines at this hour. The big news today, the fall of Baghdad. But some Baghdad residents have begun looting offices of Iraq's totalitarian government. U.S. troops, meanwhile, report they are still meeting scattered resistance. But for the most part, their arrival and Saddam Hussein's apparent departure seem to be getting quite a warm welcome. A timeline of all of today's major events in Iraq is just about a minute away. In Swampscott, Massachusetts today, they mourned the first American journalist to lose his life covering the war in Iraq. Michael Kelly was a columnist for the Washington Post and editor-at-large for the Atlantic Monthly. He died Friday when the Humvee he was in plunged into a canal. To other news now, the war and fears about SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome, continue to trouble the nation's airlines. The industry lobbying group reports traffic is down now more than 25% from last year along the Atlantic and Pacific routes. A document found at the Rhode Island nightclub that burned down in February suggests the club had overstated its capacity. That's according to lawyers for some of the victims and their families. The document lists club capacity at 550, well over the town's cap of 404. 99 people were killed in the fire. We'll take a quick break for now and then come back with more of CNN's continuing coverage of the war in Iraq.
Miles O'Brien. In Baghdad. Next, countdown.
MSNBC's coverage of Operation Iraqi Freedom continues with the countdown. Here is Keith Olbermann.
Good evening. It was the baseball player Yogi Berra who famously said it ain't over till it's over. Except when it is. It isn't over in Iraq. On the other hand, it is. 8 o'clock in the east, 5 Pacific, 4 a.m. in Baghdad, a city divided between explosions and explosions of joy. It is not quite the relief of Baghdad. It is not quite the liberation of Baghdad, but politically, psychologically, and militarily, it is. As the Iraqis' envoy to the UN said wearily this afternoon, game over. Saddam Hussein has not been dragged through the streets of Baghdad, but his statue sure has. It is a tradition as old as despotism itself, and as sociologically unmistakable as a quick kick to the pants. A 40-foot high likeness of the local dictator crashes to the ground in the middle of his capital. They did it to the statues of Stalin. They did it to the statues of Hitler. 2,000 years ago, they did it to the statues of the Roman Emperor Caligula. And it always means the same thing. Today, it was Saddam Hussein's turn. Mike Nicholson of our affiliated British network ITV was there.
Well, we waited a long time for these guys to turn up, and here they are in the middle of Baghdad, not on the other side of the Tigris, but right here in the center. And then, are you happy to see this?
I am very happy. I am very happy to see this.
Well, the Iraqis, having failed with their rope noose, the Americans have now shown them how really to topple Saddam Hussein. It's now 7:15 on Wednesday, the 9th of April. And, well, let's use that old cliche, an historic day. 4, 3, 2, 1. There it goes. The end of Saddam Hussein. One last pull. Goodbye, Saddam. This really is the most astonishing. There it goes. There it goes. What a moment. We've said this many times in our lives, haven't we, at moments like this, that there'll never be a day like this. Well, believe me, having covered the news for the last 40 years, I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. The death of Saddam Hussein, symbolically toppled by the Americans at 10 minutes to 7 on Wednesday, the 9th of April. They've come in 350 miles from the south. Despite Saddam's threat of a ring of steel around the city, despite Saddam's threat of a human barrier to stop the Americans coming in, they have arrived. And you know, not a shot has been fired in anger against them. How about that?
Mike Nicholson reporting from Baghdad. All day, everywhere, you have seen those pictures. What you have not seen, what you've not heard, are the voices of the Iraqi citizens, stilled these many years of suffering and repression, or of the U.S. Marines who were there to vicariously enjoy another people's freedom. You will hear them now. Your witness in East Baghdad is the ITV reporter John Irvine.
Venture out was a calculated risk, but an irresistible one. We'd heard no gunfire, and there were enough Iraqi cars on the road to give us confidence. One of the first places we reached was an office used by Saddam Hussein's secret police. Here, his numerous portraits were going up in flames. At last, ordinary Iraqis were showing their true feelings towards their leader. When people saw our camera, they couldn't hide their delight at the turn of events. Further on, we spoke to some civilians who told me how they felt.
Saddam going.
Yes.
Saddam going. Saddam. I am happy. I am happy.
Feeling free. Freedom. Then, all of a sudden, the United States Marines showed up.
This is one of those extraordinary moments. Something I never really thought I would see on the streets of the Iraqi capital.
The Americans gestured for us to come and meet them.
How you doing? My name's John Irvine. Sorry, come on. How you doing? From IT.
Much of Iraq is free from years of oppression. Televisions across the world today are filled with images of jubilant Iraqis who know the regime is coming to an end. There is still work to be done, and the coalition remains confident of the outcome. In the course of the campaign, young men and women have sacrificed their lives for this cause, and we continue to remember them.
While looting was on the upswing in Baghdad, it appeared to be on the decline in Basra after many stories confirming the fact that looters had stolen large quantities of food to sell on the black market. Then at 8 a.m. Eastern Time, Basra was reported calm following 2 days of that kind of looting. British forces in control of the southern city are turning their attention to its pressing humanitarian needs. Observers say there is much work to be done. The city's main hospital is filled with patients wounded in this past weekend's fighting, and just 1/3 of its doctors showed up for work today. Wolf?
Thanks, Paula. Despite the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime, pockets of resistance remain. CNN's Martin Savage was with a U.S. Marine battalion at about 9 a.m. Eastern when it suddenly came under heavy fire in Baghdad.
For the 1st Battalion's 7th Marines, the road into Baghdad was paved with cheers, waves, and smiles. For the young Marines who battled for 3 weeks to reach the capital, it was a moment to savor. But not everyone in the city apparently welcomed their presence. Photographer Scott McWhinney was riding with a lead assault team crossing over the Tigris River when an Iraqi gunboat down below suddenly opened fire. The Marines immediately returned fire, pointing their machine guns into the water below, silencing the attack. Moments later, the trailing convoy began taking fire from the campus of Baghdad University. Machine gun rounds and rocket-propelled grenades were striking at the armored column. Infantry scattered to take cover and begin organizing a counterattack, supported by armored personnel carriers and tanks. At one point, an APC acted as a battering ram, punching through an outer wall, allowing the Marines to move in. From the tall grass surrounding the campus, they organized firing teams of machine guns, the Iraqi opposition hitting them from several different buildings. With disciplined bursts, the fire teams took on their targets. High on their lists, pickup trucks armed with machine guns. One after another, they were destroyed. In the words of commanders, this was a full-on fight. But as big as it looked, the engagement was limited only to the campus. While Iraqis celebrated only blocks away, these young Marines were involved in the fight of their lives. The battle reached its peak when the fighting ignited a huge storage of anti-aircraft ammunition, touching off a deadly firestorm. Eventually, all of it stopped, and the Marines moved in to check their kills. Some clearly wondering if they might have just taken part in the last battle for Baghdad. Martin Savage, CNN, with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, Baghdad.
And then during the 9 a.m. hour Eastern Time, we heard about celebrations in northern Iraq. There was joy in Erbil, the administrative capital of the Iraqi Kurds. People danced in the streets, waved flags, honked car horns to show their delight over the day's developments. Pictures of Saddam Hussein were slashed and burned. Despite those festivities, there was continued fighting in some parts of northern Iraq. The Associated Press reported that U.S. and Kurdish forces captured a radar and communications center 10 miles northeast of Mosul, the largest city still under the regime's control. Wolf?
Thanks, Paula. After the break, we'll pick up our timeline in the 10 a.m. hour, an image to last a lifetime. Baghdad falls into coalition hands as a symbol of Saddam Hussein's power falls to the ground. Plus,
and perhaps as much as one brigade of a Republican Guards division up there.
But it's feared the toughest battle could still be fought against Republican Guard forces guarding Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's birthplace. While in Baghdad today, an exuberant U.S. Marine draped the American flag over the head of a Saddam Hussein statue.